Hello there, and welcome to the final video in this Gaming Through History series, where we'll be wrapping up the historical timeline for Paradox. And as I said in the previous video, it's unfortunate that we're wrapping it up without any Total War games to sit parallel. Total War wraps up its timeline, if you like, at the end. Well, in the middle, if you will, of the Napoleonic Wars, we do have the Battle of Waterloo as a standalone battle in Napoleon Total War, and we do have actually the USA independence campaign, the Road to Independence campaign in Empire, which is something of a tutorial campaign and goes deeper into the 1800s, but I think you couldn't really call that part of the main Total War sort of historical timeline, if you will. So we wrap up Total War in 1812, which is a shame because I think the Victoria period, which we're going to talk about in this video, that spans from 1836 to 1936, I think would have been a great place for Total War to continue, moving into the modern period with the First World War as the sort of end game crisis, if you will. And then, of course, we move into the Second World War with Hearts of Iron 4. And again, a game, an era that it's surprising that Total War hasn't addressed. I mean, after all, if you're starting a video game series called Total War, you probably always have in the back of your head the desire to create a Second World War themed Total War game. There's no more Total War than World War II. So it is, as we've touched on throughout this series, really, it is a bit surprising that Total War hasn't continued so far into the modern era, and something to do with technical and sort of capacity limitations, one would say. But we'll talk about that more in our kind of wrap-up video, I think. But in this video, I've called it Worlds at War because even though Paradox titles aren't focused on conflict, the two games we're looking at do have at their heart warfare. Victoria 2 less so, but Hearts of Iron 4, on the other hand, a game entirely about the Second World War, where you play through just a few years, really, covering the span of the Second World War. And the game is kind of all about following the world as it descends into madness, descends into the chaos, confusion, and catastrophe of the Second World War, and depending on whichever nation you choose, fighting your way out to victory or ignominy. So anyway, looking at the two games side by side, these are, Victoria 2 in particular is a real favorite of mine. I really enjoyed playing this game. It's a historical period that I'm particularly interested in. I did some years ago actually start a PhD, which I've talked about in the intro to this series, but it's it was looking at the post-colonial experience, if you like, in South America. So a little bit before the start date of Victoria 2, but this is probably the period I've spent the most time looking at and researching, if you perhaps the sort of early to mid 1800s. And there's an awful lot that we're going to touch on that make this for a really fascinating period of history to play through and experience and immerse yourself in through gaming. And again, that's why it's such a shame, really, that Total War and Creative Assembly sort of didn't find a way of venturing into this time period. Both games, you can see, perform very well. The critic reviews are good for Victoria 2, 75, for Hearts of Iron 4, 83. The user scores similarly very good, 8.3 versus 7.8. Surprised to a certain extent that Hearts of Iron 4 isn't a wee bit higher there, considering the the very strong following the game has to this day, despite being sort of 8+ years old. And Victoria 2, of course, has recently been superseded, if you like, by Victoria 3, which I chose not to play in this series because it feels like it's still a game in development. Again, touching on the sort of Paradox commercial strategy that we've talked about throughout this series. It's a game that launched better, let's say, than Imperator Rome, but not great. It has received plenty of criticism for being seemingly quite buggy and sort of inconsistent in terms of how it plays, and perhaps feature light as Paradox go about fleshing out the experience. But Victoria 2, it's nice to pick it up now as a complete experience. There's very little in the way of DLC and add-ons for the game. Admittedly, getting to 15 years old now, but still a really fun, interesting, immersive experience, and an experience that really does take its history seriously, and that's what we're going to touch on in this video. So, yeah, again, disappointing we can't put a Total War game alongside a Paradox game in this time frame, not least because it does feel ripe for the Total War setting, both the Victoria period and the Hearts of Iron 4 period. For Victoria 2, 1836 to 1936, as I explained. So really interesting 100 years. Again, we look at so many of Paradox's main historical titles, and they're covering hundreds and hundreds of years. So this is something of a departure for it to only be 100 years. And that works quite well. In some instances, depending on the faction you have, campaigns can be really quite quick because you are managing your economy, you are managing your industry, you are managing your populations, and you can kind of sit back and let it run as a bit of a simulation for some time, which is a very different style of gameplay to the sort of hands-on experience you might expect from a Total War game. But it does mean that you can see some quite interesting changes develop as the game progresses. And this 100-year period is huge. It's huge in terms of development. When you think about it, although we don't want to emphasize the conflict elements of the game when there are so many other areas to it, I think looking at military technology, for example, is a pretty clear way of sort of illustrating the changes that one can see over the course of this 100 years. In the 1830s, we're not long out of the Napoleonic period, where you're talking about formation warfare, you're talking about lines of battle, you're talking about large infantry formations, the rifle, the musket. At sea, we're still using wind-borne ships of the line. As the century develops, by the time we're out of the First World War and we're into the 1930s, aircraft that were barely imaginable in the 1830s are becoming an increasingly significant part of military and civilian life. At sea, the navies are made up of dreadnought battleships, huge steam-powered metal hulks that again would have been almost unimaginable in the 1830s. So, we talk about the development and the changes that one might see over the hundreds of years covered in earlier titles, covered in EU4 and CK2. But here, in just 100 years, the radical changes that we see born by the Industrial Revolution are pretty extreme. Of course, that goes to industrial productivity, output, but also declines in living standards, the pollution and the strife caused by rapid urbanization, rapid and sort of unmanaged urbanization, tenements, disease, etc. All of these ratchet up as we go through this 100 years, as we see the impacts of the Industrial Revolution on societies, on economies, and on militaries. But a period of great change. And as you can see there, although it might not be, although it is kind of referred to in some sort of historical circles as sort of a Pax Britannica, where the sort of almost global hegemony of the British Empire creates an era of peace. It's also a period, marked by many colonial wars fought by the British, many other significant wars, particularly in Europe when we look at the Prussian and Austrian wars, and then the Franco-Prussian War that leads to the formation of Germany. And of course, with the formation of Germany, with the arrival of sort of a new European superpower that wishes to challenge for global interest, for global influence, that wishes to develop an empire beyond European borders so that it has the resources and the manpower to compete with Britain, to compete with France, to compete with Russia, a nation that feels surrounded by these large empires. We have the collapse of sort of civility that ends in the First World War. So it's a really dramatic 100 years. So many interesting themes to explore, so many interesting developments on and off the battlefield that would play into the changing landscape of a game setting this period. So ripe for representation in this medium. So again, disappointing that Creative Assembly didn't enter into this period for my mind. But Victoria 2 does it really well, and we'll get onto those themes in a moment. Different again then is Hearts of Iron 4, that runs from 1936 through to 1948, or the end of the World War, or the start date of 1939. So you're plunged. So they obviously run alongside each other. They run concurrently. What I haven't done here is done the sort of long campaign where I've imported, saved some other games and created that long timeline. That just seems like such an enormous endeavor, and I was kind of interested to see how each game treats its historical setting without creating that continuous timeline. But of course, in 1936, we leave off Victoria 2 with the world being faced by great wars. So the Great War is a function that comes on in the late game in Victoria 2. And we don't naturally sort of move into the interwar period. Obviously, Victoria 2's, the alternate timelines you create are not leading directly to World War II. But in 1936, and the way that Hearts of Iron 4 is presented, we are already in preparation basically for World War II. And you can follow alt history paths that sort of swerve World War II in a way, or obviously lend itself to very different conflicts. But ultimately the game, as opposed to Victoria 2 and many other Paradox titles, is all about conflict. There isn't much in the way of the sort of social and economic functions, and the game is all about watching the world decline into, as I say, into the chaos and the madness of a truly global conflict, as different factions form along ideological lines, and then they sort of face off as global blocks. Within Hearts of Iron 4, you can choose to play historical, and that means that both the computer and the human player can follow the historical choices of their respective focus trees. As the player, obviously, you still have some choice there, but the computer will stick to that historical timeline. That means you can more or less play out World War II almost blow by blow, with different events occurring in a similar kind of pace, and sort of by the time the war starts, then whether you've started in 1936 or particularly if you started in 1939, then in a way the various world factions are in a similar place to which they were historically. So you can play out a sort of redo of World War II fairly accurately. Or you can choose to click off the historical settings, and then both the human can, like I say, always make the choice, but the computer will follow a random path, maybe historical, maybe not. And that lends itself to that sort of ahistorical gameplay where global conflict is inevitable, but can play out very differently to how it does historically. So 2 games with fascinating periods of history, both with an emphasis on conflict to a certain extent. Interestingly, both have Germany at the core. As I say, the formation of Germany in Victoria 2 through the Prussian and Austrian wars and the Franco-Prussian War is kind of central to how the game evolves in Europe, because Germany will, if formed, can be a very significant power. And of course, Hearts of Iron 4, with its focus on World War II, again, is very much about Germany and how that power emerges in Europe. If you're playing historical, then it will go down the fascist route, where the Nazis, begin World War II largely as they did in our historical time. Historically, Germany can go in a number of different directions that again kind of dictate how the game evolves within Europe and without. So two very interesting games, very interesting periods of history, and as I say, a shame that Total War hasn't ventured into these periods to date. So we're going to start off with Victoria 2. Again, because we haven't got games that are running parallel, we're just going to run one and then the other. So in terms of key themes, A Place in the Sun. So this is sort of the second big wave of imperial expansion. So any game that's set in this Victoria period needs to model the conflict that arises both between particularly European nations and minor world nations as they expand influence and dominion abroad, but also between those colonial nations as they compete for territory. And I suppose this is particularly pertinent when we get into the later game and we get the same sort of issues that lend itself to the Great Wars and the emergence of sort of a World War I style conflict between global alliances. Because Place in the Sun and the prestige that was felt from these European nations, the prestige deficit that was experienced by nations that didn't have overseas colonial possessions did, directly lead to conflict. And one of the great causes of World War I is that sort of strategic panic that was in Germany at the sort of beginning of the 1900s, that they were surrounded by large international empires, the British to the north and controlling the Atlantic, the French to the west, the Russians to the east, and their empire that now spanned Asia. And Germany, wedged in the middle, was of a mind that they needed sort of a cataclysmic conflict. They needed to defeat these empires thoroughly in Europe to be able to sustain themselves and to be able to establish their own overseas empires, or else it was becoming to a point that it would just be too late. There would be too much power surrounding them, and they would forever be sort of a second subservient nation within Europe. So one of the great reasons that Germany sort of takes a stance of sort of pushing Austria to war and beginning World War I is this desire to take on these empires in Europe, to free themselves, to sort of free themselves up to begin expansion overseas. So this idea of A Place in the Sun is certainly a theme that can persist throughout a game set in this period, initially about colonial expansion and consolidation, but then about the conflict and the friction that erupts between nations as the sort of prestige, as different nations sort of accrue prestige for those territories and start to compete for the competing resources, the depleting territories, and start to address imbalances in terms of resource, wealth, and prestige that come from great nations that feel they want that place in the sun. And obviously this was, like I say, sort of most clearly played out in being one of the causes for war in Europe in the early 1800s. So the second theme, and especially in a sort of paradox idea, in sort of a paradox game design sort of setup, would be industrial society. So as I touched upon earlier, the technological changes that one can expect in any kind of game set in this 100-year period is extreme. And even though it needn't be focused on military technology, I think the differences that one can sort of see from 1836 through to 1936 are probably best illustrated by military technology. Obviously, World War One does kick that on significantly, as there are rapid innovations in military technologies to try and force an end to that sort of war that had landed in a sort of bloody stalemate on the Western Front, at least. So yeah, like I say, aircraft, artillery, tanks, biological and chemical weapons. I mean, all of this emerges in the latter half of this 100-year period, when it could have been almost unimaginable in the first half. And the people and the societies that we're talking about in the 1830s are far removed, really, from those in the 1930s. So any game set in this period does have to have at its heart a real significant rapid evolution of technology and industrial output at its core. And again, this is a cause for friction and conflict between nations, because touching on the first theme and themes we've covered in the previous historical titles, we're now getting closer to modern globalization, where supply networks, trade networks are truly global, and the great industrial powerhouses are becoming the great power brokers of the world, because they can put on that added value to the raw resources that are accumulated through empire. So we're still at that point where empire is seen as the great ambition of great nations, because not only of the prestige that it brings to have dominion over peoples across the world, but of the access to primary resources that allowed for the industrialization and added value goods to be created that drive wealth generation. So industrialization is a massive part of this period, and a massive theme to cover for a game that looks to explore this century. And finally, yeah, arms races. And again, I suppose it links into the two of the previous themes, the sort of competition for prestige of empire, the industrialization and growth in technologies. And as we've said, military technology more than any sort of illustrates the great changes that you would experience over this 100 years. But interestingly, when we think of World War One in particular, the arms race that's probably most referred to is that of the naval arms race, and the British Navy having become globally dominant, and particularly Germany feeling the need to establish its navy as a competitor to Britain, to be able to break free of that kind of encirclement that it felt within Europe. But another contributing factor is the artillery arms race. I mean, the power of artillery had grown significantly. In this area, the French were leading the way, as I understand it, in terms of artillery technology. So the firepower that was delivered, not just on the sea, but on the battlefield, was absolutely enormous and growing. And again, there's this sort of growing tension between nations, that if you don't, it's sort of a preemptive strike almost. If you don't strike early, then nations that have the lead in these particular arms races are going to become dominant, and nations that fall behind are going to become subservient. So both in terms of arms, but other technologies also, I think any game set in this period has to create a sort of mechanics around sort of tension and friction that comes out of unequal technological advancement, whether that's to lead to conflict or whether it's to lead to cute diplomacy around the sharing of technologies, but certainly mechanics that put technological development, industrialization, and the frictions that unequal development can cause at the heart of a game of this period. So that's how I've ranked those three areas. So again, I think, yeah, colonialism, imperialism, it's really well developed in Victoria too. You do get that competition, you get the race, the sort of scramble for Africa that we'll touch on. And you know, that I think that's really well developed in the game, as is industrial society, not least because it is part of the sort of scoring that underpins the game. Arms race, I'd say, you know, it happens, and again, this is just kind of goes to the nature of Paradox games because you're not on the battlefield, because you don't lead the armies, you don't necessarily see the power difference, you don't necessarily experience it. So it's certainly there in how militaries sort of grow and how different warfare plays out from the 1830s to the 1930s. The scale and the destruction is radically different, especially if you have armies at different kind of technology levels. You can really see an advanced army absolutely annihilating huge armies that are sort of less technologically developed. But again, because of that lack of intimacy, if you will, because you're not seeing it on the battlefield, I think it doesn't quite resonate as it might do. And yeah, fun factor, definitely a one for me. Victoria 2, one of my favorite games. And like I say, it's got different play styles, unlike many Paradox games that are quite absorbing. I think Victoria 2 is one of those games where you can play it in very different ways. You can kind of sit back and play the peaceful social and economic development game. Or you can be sort of more punchy and look to play through you know, through more military means as well. And also the way it's scored, you know, even if you're a minor nation and you're still a minor nation at the end of the game, you know, the sense of achievement that comes from, you know, being a coherent, successful society at the end of the game is there. And I think Victoria 2, unlike any of the Total War games, but many of the Paradox games as well, gives a sense of achievement, you know, whatever level you start at in the game or whatever level you finish. Survival is actually enjoyable, if you like, in Victoria 2. So these are, you know, the scores. So let's have a wee look at how the playthroughs panned out. So I've looked here. There are a number of ways you can sort of look at Victoria 2 scoring. So the great powers. So these are the 8 sort of highest ranked nations at the end of the game. And on the left here, you've got my scores. So Germany at the top, United Kingdom in second, France, China, Austria, Hungary, United States of America, Japan, and the Ottoman Empire. So across the 18 campaigns I played, these are my top 8. And scoring wise, yeah, you know, I've scored reasonably well there. The right-hand column in that graph on the left is the computer's average score for those nations. So I've outscored the computer in every with each one of those factions, with the exception of the United States of America. And this is an interesting one because the USA, as you can imagine, lives in relative isolation in North America. It can develop fairly freely, and I should have done a lot better. But what tanked my score there was actually the industrial score, and that was largely because I was looking to support the status quo. So I wasn't looking to, you know, change my governments radically. I wasn't looking to push my nation in any particular direction. If the nation was happy, I was happy to sort of maintain the government as it was. And that's one of the, I suppose, one of the criticisms of Victoria 2. It is quite easy to sort of maintain the status quo. So we don't get, you know, thinking of it as a game that sort of leads into World War II, we don't get those lurches to the left or lurches to the right. The Great Wars don't necessarily end in, you know, Germany, Italy sort of turning to fascism after the First World War, or the emergence of the Soviet Union or any kind of communist Russia because of the failures of the war. It's not hardwired into the game that conflict happens. So those great turning points in history in the early 1900s don't necessarily happen. And it is quite easy as the player to simply maintain the status quo throughout the game. And with the United States, sort of, I have this kind of liberal economic government. And for those of you who played Victoria 2, you'll probably know the pain that that brings, because the computer is just a dreadful, models that pretty dreadfully when you are. It's interesting that depending on your government type, your actions as a player are limited. And in the case of having sort of a liberal economic system, is that as the government, as you're sort of playing as the sort of government, you can't influence industrialization. You can't build factories. You can't subsidize industries. And therefore, as soon as a factory becomes inefficient, it collapses. And my economy at this point with the USA was absolutely booming. I could have more than adequately subsidized industry and had my industry score absolutely go through the roof. But because of that liberal economic setup, the computer just spends its time opening and closing factories, and yeah, the score just bounces around and tends to dwindle. So that was something of a letdown. I don't know if that's reflective of kind of liberal capitalism. I suppose capitalists will say otherwise, but having a USA that had massive pockets of unemployment because of um, overly liberal economic policies. I mean, that's, thematic perhaps for the 30s, thematic for the Great Depression. It kind of works, but it is because of a sort of a broken computer, really, rather than complex economic interaction. So anyway, so that's the case of the USA. Otherwise there's some, standouts there. As I say, the game feels like a game about Germany in some respects. If Germany does unite, if you're starting off as Prussia or any one of the other German states, once you've unified into the North German Federation, then you can move on to form Germany. And then you do emerge as an absolute powerhouse in Central Europe. And you can take that in very many directions. But like I say, it's quite easy to maintain the status quo. So you can definitely maintain a sort of monarchistic, sort of constitutional monarchy within Germany. You don't have to lurch to the right or go down a particularly expansionist route. You can definitely achieve success in other ways. But Germany, when emerged, if it emerges, does form a very significant powerhouse in Europe, which is thematic for the period, one would say. You get United Kingdom and France who are maintaining their global empires. China and Japan are also two interesting examples here, because they do start out as uncivilized nations, and uncivilized nations, dramatically slows your research capacity. There are sort of many across the map, but through westernization and entering into the industrial age, those nations can, in this case, as you can see, catch up quite significantly in terms of technology, in terms of industrial military output. And with both China and Japan, those are the two nations that have the greatest capacity to do so. There are many other uncivilized nations that struggle, remain uncivilized throughout the game, and are easily predated, let's say, by global empires. But sort of moving on then to the graph on the right. So this is sort of comparing then how my playthroughs, one campaign. So they're just listed with my average score there at sort of 5,500, compared to the computer's averages across 18 campaigns. So slight difference in that the computer has the United Kingdom, the United States up the list, Germany a little down, but an awful lot of similarity. The only entrant there is Russia. So Russia goes into the top 8 at the expense of the Ottoman Empire from my playthrough. On the far right, then, I tried to then see, well, how would this compare to IRL, to real life? And I, tried to bring together the different scoring areas of Victoria to create a kind of real world score, like which nations across the world would score highly in a sort of real world assessment. And I came out with a list that's not far removed from those of myself and the computer. The United States top, Russia I put into second place, largely because of the power of the military. So you have Germany again there, and this is interesting because obviously, putting it in 1936, the Germany of Victoria II and the Germany of our timeline are very different. Germany sits there in third place, but this is a Germany that has faced annihilation in World War One, has been soundly defeated, has been subject to the Treaty of Versailles, has suffered economic collapse, has rebounded, but then has once again, through the Great Depression, suffered economic collapse. And at this point, we're entering into the beginnings of the Nazi growth of power. So it's a very different Germany to those in the other playthroughs. The United Kingdom, similarly, in real life almost, a force heavily impacted by the First World War. And I suppose, France and particularly Austria-Hungary, I mean, they don't figure in this list because of the dismantling of the Austria-Hungary. So I think what is kind of an important takeaway here is how the end of Victoria II in game isn't necessarily impacted by a great global conflict in the same way as it obviously is in the real world. So there are a number of factions there that don't figure on the main list that otherwise might do. Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Germany, even France and Britain, still nations that are recovering from the devastation of that conflict. So this was another thing I thought I'd look at. Going to that place in the sun, colonialism theme, Scramble for Africa. So this is a kind of a key part of the game where you research and enter into the sort of colonial period, and you can start acquiring colonies. And through my 18 playthroughs, I basically just scored it as 3-2-1. So which were the three nations that acquired the most territory in Africa? So who kind of like quote unquote won the Scramble for Africa? And it's interesting that it sort of follows pretty historical lines. It's not surprising. The United Kingdom and France have a clear advantage when it comes to the Scramble for Africa because they already hold territories within Africa, so they can start to colonize and expand beyond their borders far more readily. What was interesting, however, is that the Ottomans come into third place, with Germany, Spain, and then Scandinavia amongst the nations that through the playthroughs managed to acquire most territory in Africa. The Ottomans at this point are being seen as the sick man of Europe. It's an empire that is seen in pretty chronic decline, and that's another reason for the increasing frictions within Europe as the great powers compete amongst each other to position themselves to best benefit from the final collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And this leads to a lot of the friction in the Balkans that again leads us into World War One, as Austria-Hungary, as Russia, Britain, and others kind of position themselves to acquire territories from the Ottoman Empire, rather than, in this case, we see the Ottoman Empire continuing to expand through the period and developing perhaps a more significant African empire. So then, to just sort of wrap up Victoria II, then, as I've said, at a number of times through the chat, if Germany forms a nation as a dominant force in Europe, so that's an important aspect of the game, really. Even though there are these sort of global things at play, Germany as an emerging power does radically influence the course of history of this 100-year period, and that's not untrue of our own historical timeline. Obviously, the history of the 18 and 1900s would be very different if Prussia had not been successful in consolidating Germany, and instead we either did have a remainder, a smaller Prussian state, or a more disparate union between the German Federation, for example. Japan and China are the only uncivilized nations that regularly achieve great power status, with the Ottoman Empire and Spain consistently losing great power status. So again, this is where Victoria II does sort of reflect history pretty well. Obviously, one of the features of colonial and imperial development is the forced underdevelopment of nations around the world that are dominated by the great powers. And so it is thematic that Japan and China, because of their scale, because of their ability to resist foreign influences, are the nations that can kind of break free of European colonial predation, if you like, and become great powers in their own right. And similarly, even though in my playthrough, the Ottoman Empire managed to maintain great power status across the computers campaigns, there is the sick man of Europe does, if you like, come to bear for the Ottoman Empire, that does see its power and its prestige and its dominion decrease. And the same too for Spain, who, which is a nation that, at the start of the 1830s has largely lost its overseas empire due to the Napoleonic Wars and losing its ability to administer its global empire. And so these are two nations that in Victoria II, as in our timeline, if you like, are kind of destined for decline. The final one is industry score has a greater scale priority factor expansion and education. So yeah, this is an interesting one in terms of how Victoria II is scored. As I said, my decreased score for the United States was largely because my industrial score didn't increase as much as it might have done. And when you look at the compartmentalized scores of how you achieve great power status and how you achieve your score in Victoria II, industry is the key one. That's the score that can really go through the roof. And I suppose that leads into a kind of an illustration of what key themes Paradox were looking to get through in this game. Like, military and other achievements aside, developing your industry is kind of the key to the game. And as we said throughout this piece, the 100 years spanning from the 1830s to the 1930s is characterized by immense technological advancement and industrial development. And so it's it's very thematic that should be the case. And I suppose bringing it back to Total War, if a game were to be established in this period, you would expect industry to be at its core rather than or alongside conflict. So moving on to Hoi 4 then. So we're just going to segue straight into Hearts of Iron 4 here, and we're going to look at those key themes that don't sort of move from the, unfortunately, they don't run through from Vic 2 into Hoi 4 necessarily, but we're moving directly from the early 1930s to the late 1930s. And I suppose the first one is global tension. And this is illustrated very clearly in Hoi 4 because of that ratcheting up of friction between nations that lends itself then to global conflict. And this does come out of all of those themes we've discussed in Victoria II, however, the place in the sun and the competition for global territories and prestige, the industrialized society and the competition again between nations for primary resources and for access to industry, and of course the arms races and the tension that comes from disparities between the power of militaries. Obviously, in our timeline, one of the greatest causes for World War II was World War I. So again, it's something we've touched on a lot, but how World War I sort of brought these global tensions to a head, exploded so spectacularly, and then led to even further division along those lines, directly leads into that ratcheting up of world tensions as nations kind of look to right wrongs in this context. But again, any game that is created that is set in the 1930s, moving into the 1940s, needs to create this growing sense of tension that comes from the unrest and conflicts that are emerging across the globe before they kind of coalesce into one globe spanning war. And yeah, Foy4 does that exceptionally well because it's kind of its main dynamic. So the second is ideology. So kind of bringing on from tensions. The tensions not only come from colonial prestige, from historical rivalry, but they also come from the emergence of these competing ideologies. And this is something that Victoria 2 kind of struggled with. Like I say, it's very easy for both the computer and the human to maintain the status quo in Victoria 2. And in that sense, you don't get the lurches to, you're right. You don't, it was quite rare, for example, to see communism emerge in Russia, to see fascism emerge in Germany. So when you're in 1930s, Victoria 2, you're kind of looking at a globe that is largely made up of monarchies that are sort of still closely related to those of the 1830s. Maybe they're sort of slightly more constitutional, maybe they're slightly more authoritarian, but the global political status quo remains somewhat unmoved from the 1830s to the 1930s. But this is, of course, in stark contrast to our historical timeline, that through processes, including the First World War, sees the destruction of many of these former ideologies and the coalescing and power centralizing around these very, very ambitious and militarized ideologies, particularly obviously the Soviet Union and fascism within Europe, and East Asia competing with democratic and monarchic forces at their borders. So any game again that's set in the 1930s has to create this global tension that isn't just about resources and just about military engagement, but is also about ideological difference. And again, Foy4 does this very well in that factions do coalesce around their ideologies. One thing I would say, though, is that Foy4 doesn't really go anywhere near far enough to give a player a sort of true historical representation of, say, what it is to be a fascist nation. And I mean, I think being the last game in the series, this takes us right back to the core question of this series, which is how do you represent historical themes and historical processes through games, and how accurately might you do it? I mean, if we were to properly represent fascism, in a game, how would that play out? Like, should it be fun to play as communist Soviet Union or Nazi Germany? Is it okay to put fascism in a game and not engage with the realities of that ideology, of the heavily racialized and Machiavellian policies that were implemented through the ideology? I don't know. It's complicated. I mean, this is a screenshot of a successful run with Japan, whereas you can see sort of the Axis powers are largely dominant across the globe. I mean, you may well have seen Man in the High Castle and other alt history. What would it be like to live in that world? For an awful lot of people, very horrible. And how well can that ever be represented in a game that needs to be fun? Complicated question there, but one that has to be, can't be shied away from if you're setting a game in the World War II era. And that brings us on to sort of the third theme of World War II, and that is just the rank brutality of it. I mean, this is really, this is a period of conflict unlike any other. And again, a game that looks to represent World War II really should engage with that. I mean, yes, the ideologies were brutal, the conflict was brutal. There's a great many aspects to World War II that seem impossible to represent in a game, is it irresponsible to not attempt to put them in the game? And the brutality is much and varied. Obviously, the brutality of the Nazi regime, of its treatment of certain certain social groups, well documented. The brutality of the Japanese invasions of China, the brutality of the nuclear weapons used to force Japan's surrender at the end of the war. The mass. A lot of this isn't portrayed in game. We sort of focus on military deaths, for example. We don't focus on the civilian, but you can attack civilian infrastructure, but it doesn't really point to the men, women, children, other non-combatants that might be killed through the player's actions. Nuclear weapons are in the game, but we don't really engage with the destruction and brutality of a nuclear strike. So how would that ever get represented in a game that is, again, fun? I think it's really, really tough, really tough to square. And in sort of looking at this series, it's made me reflect quite a lot on the representation of history in gaming. Perhaps that's a reason why Total War shied away ultimately from World War II. But it's not as if it isn't an era that is very well represented in gaming. But does any game truly look to represent issues such as the brutality of the ideologies at play of the warfare, its effect on civilians and marginalized populations? Well, no, we aren't going to see that in a game anytime soon. And one does have to ask the question if it is sort of irresponsible not to do so. So for those reasons, then I suppose I've marked Hearts of Iron 4 quite hard. Global tension, certainly the ratcheting up, it's there throughout. That sense of doom that comes from the ever sort of decaying diplomatic and civility across the world that leads to war. And then for ideologies and brutality, they are there, they are present, but again, there's a question there about how well they're represented when you are playing as whether it be, for example, a fascistic regime or maybe a totally democratic regime that deploys nuclear weapons in such an indiscriminate way as you can in Hearts of Iron 4. So there's certainly some gaps there that Hearts of Iron 4 doesn't attempt to fill in, and for quite obvious yet perplexing reasons. Fun factor, yes, it's a 1. It is one of Paradox's most popular games and is very well put together, despite the fact that the history it's portraying is pretty tricky to represent fully in a strategy game. So how am I going to do the scoring? So scoring in Hoi 4 is different to many other games in that it's at the end of the game you do get a score, but it's purely based on your basically the size of your armed forces at the end of the game. So it's not apart from quite apart from every other Paradox game where there's sort of an accumulation of many different factors. In a way, Hoi 4 scores nations based on their, if you like, the ability for the next war. And again, that is an interesting way of looking at the Second World War, because of course, upon the culmination of the Second World War, we then sort of lead on into the Cold War. And in a way, coming out of the Second World War, the biggest factor is that Russia, representing, if you like, communism, the Soviet Union, and America, representing capitalistic democracies, are the two most powerful militaries on the planet by some way. And it's kind of that result that defines the end of World War II and the history that follows. And so in a way, that's what Hoi4 looks to represent in its scores, which are the nations that have emerged from this conflict, powerful and able to continue to sort of establish their global hegemony, or at least their sort of regional hegemony, and become the power players of the future. So we'll come to the scores, but for Hoi4, I thought I'd do two playthroughs to explore how the alt history kind of plays out, because we're looking at this very defined period. So first off, I went for historical AI off. So as we said, the player has the option at the outset to toggle historical AI on or off. So this is the historical AI off, but as the player, I'm looking to play the status quo. And in a way, it's probably the worst way of playing Hoi4, because as the player, I kind of tied myself to the historical timeline. I was going to be fascist if I was Germany. I was going to be democratic if I was Britain, for example. But I've let the AI have its historical setting off, so it can go in any which direction. So I can't react, if you like, to how computer plays its campaign. But I thought it was, the most loyal way of playing the game to this series and what I look to represent. So what occurs then? Well, the sort of lead into World War II, we get Italy at war. That's one of the main conflicts to open up Hoi4. Italy is starts at war in 1936 with Ethiopia, and as you can see, Italy is victorious in the same way it was historically, albeit slightly later in July 36 rather than May. Now, the German Civil War is an interesting one because, again, having toggled historical AI off, I had the DLCs that would allow for Germany to go into civil war, and having done that, it can then go in different directions, become reinstate the monarchy or go down the democratic route. Now, across the 17 campaigns, Germany actually remained fascist more than it went into civil war. So in this timeline, in this alt timeline, I'm sticking to a fascist Germany. Although if Germany did go into civil war, it did end up largely becoming monarchist, which is sort of an interesting aside. And the whole civil war thing is quite interesting. It's interesting to see Germany emerge as a non-fascist regime, and then you really are into alt history world. Everything changes. So a bit like Victoria 2, the game is very much centered around Germany's history. In this particular period. The Spanish Civil War then is another event that always sort of triggers in the early game. As you can see, it triggers around about the same time because we're going down, because the computers have gone down its focus tree. It does trigger at a similar time to our timeline, July 36. In this timeline, however, we have a democratic victory. So ATL is the old timeline one. So we do have a democratic victory, which leads to Spain becoming a communist nation. So that's a departure from history. So we end up with a left-leaning democratic Spain at the end of the Spanish Civil War, which doesn't last as long as it does in our timeline. Democratic victory in February 38 as opposed to April 39. So going down, so we do have the occupation of the Rhineland, March 36, the beginning of appeasement, if you like, within Europe. The Soviet Union Civil War. So this is, like the German Civil War, it can trigger depending on the route that the Soviet Union takes on its focus tree. And in this case, for the majority of playthroughs, we did have a civil war, and Lev Kamenev was the winner. So this is sort of our first major departure from history, if you like. So Soviet Union does descend into civil war. Stalin is challenged. He is ultimately defeated, removed from power, and Lev Kamenev becomes the Soviet leader. Now, this is an interesting one. I'm not massively aware of Lev Kamenev and his politics, but having read into him, he does appear to be a more moderate more moderate leader than Stalin, which is easily done. But how interesting would it be to see a Soviet Union led by Lev Kamenev rather than Stalin? I think the general takeaway would that it would be a Soviet Union more open to internal and external investment, slightly more open to positive relations with the West. Certainly a communist bloc that, would maintain, its isolation, but would just be ever so slightly more open than the Soviet Union of Stalin. So a slight departure of history there, but not a massive collapse of the Soviet Union as might happen if the computer had taken other non-historical routes. So then we get a number of events that largely follow history. So we do get the Japanese invasion of China later than in our timeline, July 39, but we get the major conflict of the Second World War, i.e. the Sino-Japanese wars kicking off in the late 30s. Anschluss, occupation of Sudetenland. So again, we continue into the appeasement period. We get Nazi Germany starting to push and expand its borders. Because of the Civil War, however, we don't get the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So again, this is a departure from history. So at this point, there is no clear alliance of Germany and the Soviet Union as we get into the Second World War. But nonetheless, in January 1940, so slightly later than in our historical timeline, Germany still does invade Poland, and this would be as in our historical timeline, the primary kicker that leads to war across Europe as the Allies declare war on Germany in support of Poland. Now, what's interesting, and we'll come to this in the next slide, is that because of the game design, really, a phony war as we have in our timeline isn't really possible, and so this does spark conflict across Europe in January 1940. The Soviet Union attacking Finland again, largely because of the Soviet Union taking a different tack, and perhaps because of Lev Kamenev's perhaps more moderate approach. There is no winter war, so there's no attack on Finland, but nonetheless, the League of Nations does dissolve, and in fact, it's dissolved in March 38, over a year before it's dissolved in our timeline because of conflicts in the Balkans and Greece. So these are major flashpoints, Greek independence, etc., that caused the dissolution of the League of Nations, which, although not seen as a massive factor in the onset of World War II, certainly don't help in terms of removing one international body from the play that might allow for negotiation of peace. So the League of Nations dissolved in March 38. So sometime, almost 2 years before Germany invades Poland, but dissolved largely because of conflict in the Balkans rather than conflict in the Baltic. So then we get into the World War proper, if you like, and it all happens fairly quickly. So our timeline is sort of, kind of a short, sharp shock, really. World War II isn't as destructive, really, or at least it doesn't feel as destructive as it was in the real world. So, like I say, a lack of a phony war. Germany, having invaded Poland, is now facing war on 2 fronts. Germany does move to invade Denmark and Norway, but it does so later in the timeline. We have a later start to the war, but because of conflict on the western border, the invasion of Denmark and Norway is delayed until the August. Germany invades Benelux. Again, slightly earlier this time because of there not really being able to be sort of static borders, if you like, in Hoi 4. And that leads to the fall of Paris. Germany is still successful in invading France, defeating the Allied armies and annexing France, if you like. But sometime later, so rather than June 40, we're talking about November 1941, when Germany is ultimately successful in defeating the Allies in Western Europe. Having said that, the later victory in Western Europe doesn't come with a later invasion of Eastern Europe. I mean, seems to be an incredibly ambitious alt history version of Nazi Germany, because they declare war on the Soviet Union in December 1940, almost a year before they're successful in defeating the French. And I suppose this is somewhat influenced by the lack of that Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because of the lack of an alliance with the Soviet Union at the beginning of the war. And this, as in our timeline, does ultimately lead to Germany's defeat. For anyone who's played Hoi 4, the invasion of Russia is a grinding, torrid affair. And ultimately the Germans are pushed back, but not until January 49. It's January 49 that Germany is defeated. Now, what is interesting here is that the way the war plays out is very plausible. It's very plausible. The lack of the lack of the sort of Nazi-Soviet pact to begin the war with the invasion of Poland, it does lead to Germany being, a more isolated actor at the outset of World War II. It struggles on the Western Front, takes longer to occupy the territories of France, occupy the Low Countries, occupy Scandinavia, is nonetheless still driven because of ideology and ambition to invade the Soviet Union. But then with the war persisting on two fronts for some time, does eventually struggle and is eventually pushed back. The war in the Pacific, though, is far more limited. Say that the USA joins the war. My observation was actually quite infrequent. Japan struggles in its war with China, doesn't directly provoke the United States. And so without the USA joining the war, there isn't the manpower and technology pumped into Europe to push back the Nazis in Africa, in Italy, and ultimately in D-Day, which again is something that didn't occur often enough to be sort of average. So Germany does eventually face defeat. Again, the bulk of the fighting happens on the Eastern Front, where Germany's armies are eventually worn down. Eventually, the Allies in the West are able to mount a counterattack, but the war does persist for another 4 years longer than it does in our timeline, but it is largely a European war. You kind of have two world wars in this instance. Well, two parallel conflicts. You have the war between China and Japan, which plays out largely as that, a war between China and Japan. Japan doesn't enter into a strong alliance with the Nazis. America isn't brought into the Pacific War, isn't particularly brought into the European War. And so the defeat for Germany does come at the hands of the Allies, but allies led by Britain and France and the Soviet Union. So that makes it pretty plausible that the war would go on for another 4 years without the additional power of the USA. Germany does eventually grind itself to defeat on the Eastern Front, but there isn't that emergence of that significant military power to then push them back rapidly into Germany. So the war persists for another 4 years. We go to 1949, and that is ultimately when Germany is defeated in this alt history timeline. So the Allies emerge victorious, but after another 4 years worth of fighting in Europe. And in Japan, the war remains, in the Pacific even, the war kind of remains a sort of theater conflict between the Chinese and the Japanese. So yeah, the alternative timeline, how would we talk it through? So Italy is victorious in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Democratic forces win the Spanish Civil War. Hitler rises to power in Germany and begins expansion in Central Europe, beginning with the reoccupation of the Rhineland in March 1936. Japan invades China in 1937, leading to a brutal yet regional conflict. Frictions between Balkan nations leads to the League of Nations being dissolved in March 1938. Factionalism in the Soviet Union leads to civil war against Stalin during the summer of 1938, with moderate Lev Kamenev gaining power. The USA passes the Neutrality Act in April 1939, committing not to intervene in escalating conflicts in Europe. And again, this is kind of reflected in the fact that America doesn't enter the war in any meaningful way. Nazi Germany invades Poland in January 1940, followed quickly by the Benelux region in February, and Denmark and Norway in August 1940 in a lightning campaign. So we sort of fast forward a bit at this point because of the lack of a phony war. Confident from early successes against the Allies in France and the Low Countries, Nazi Germany declares war on the Soviet Union in December 1940. Paris falls in November 1941. However, prolonged attritional warfare on the Russian front drains national resources. Nazi Germany sues for peace in January 1949. So that's our alternative timeline. That's how our alternative world plays out across the 17 campaigns I played through there. So then what is the sort of final outcome? Well, on the left-hand side, we have the average scores. So these are across 17 campaigns, and on the right, we have my scores for the campaigns sort of I played as. The United Kingdom comes out on top. In my campaign, I did manage to form the Commonwealth of Nations. So this is where all of Britain's global territories do unite as sort of a reunified federal empire. So there Britain really does come out as by far and away the strongest force. Austria-Hungary does pretty well out of the average campaign, sort of a re-emerging Austria-Hungary. Again, this is the alt history timeline, so anything is technically possible. Germany, despite defeat, remains a power. USA, you might say, because of its neutrality, doesn't massively expand its armed forces, but is still a world power. Japan sort of remains in that sort of drawn-out conflict with China in the Pacific, so maintains itself as a world power. France, Poland, Italy, they will re-emerge, if you will, at the end of the conflict as, recovering world powers, let's say, having faced defeat to Germany at the beginning of the war. And then, yeah, so those are my individual playthrough scores. A few interesting emergencies there. You got the Danubian Confederation. So this was a sort of democratic Austria-Hungary Empire, if you like, the German Reich. So I was actually successful, if you want, in my campaign of maintaining the Nazi party, if you will. Reino del Sul, so there's a monarchic Italy that emerges. So you've got some alt history nations that emerge through my playthroughs, in particular, with Turkey again. So again, you have the Ottoman Empire persisting through Victoria II, and then emerging as a a power at the end of Hearts of Iron 4 as well. So the second campaign I played was historical AI on. So in a way, this is kind of how you're supposed to play HO4. This is playing World War II. So let's see how things differed when we were far more tighter to our historical timeline. So again, we have Italy at war in Ethiopia. They're successful slightly later. Spanish Civil War again triggers. So we don't, in this case, we don't have the German Civil War. We don't have the Soviet Civil War. We still get the occupation of Rhineland. Italy occupies Albania, but yeah, 3 years later than it does in real life. Again, this is largely because of the focus tree and the direction it takes you in. USA passes the Neutrality Act ever so slightly later. And again, Japan invades China as a fascistic nation, as a fascist nation. We get the Anschluss ever so slightly earlier. Again, we go through appeasement with Germany expanding its borders through aggressive military action and through diplomacy. We do have, in this case, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because Stalin remains in control of Soviet Russia and eventually pursues an awkward alliance with the Nazi Party. Germany invades Poland in August 1939, so ever so slightly earlier. We do get the Winter War. We do get the Soviet Union invasion of Finland 6 months later, and that does lead to the dissolving of the League of Nations. So, as we said, very limited phony war. So we don't have this sort of prolonged period of sort of, if you will, gesticulations between the nations, because it's hard to have sort of static fronts in Hooivork. But we do get, Germany's invasion, earlier than we do in our timeline. But Paris also falls earlier, so the German war machine is more efficient in this timeline. December 1939, as opposed to June 40, is when Paris falls in this particular timeline. So then we do get the German invasion of Soviet Union, so that awkward alliance does still collapse along historical lines. Germany, for again, ideological and ambition regions, looks to invade the Soviet Union, expand its territory east. USA does join the war 6 months earlier this time. In game, it's triggered by the Japanese invading the Philippines. There isn't sort of a Pearl Harbor style event, but that's more the trigger that brings the USA into the war, as the Japanese have sort of entered into that alliance with the Germans. So war in the Pacific leads to war in Europe, and USA joining the Second World War in both theaters. And then eventually we get the German surrender in July 1945, so just 2 months later, with Japan surrendering in May 48. Now, again, I haven't really put much in there. A lack of detail about how the war actually plays out. But in essence, it does play out as we see IRL. Germany invades Russia, in this case, in the summer of 41, similar time frame to real life. And it just becomes a bloodbath. There is destruction on the Eastern Front. The German army will have its successes, but ultimately the attrition and the resistance of the Russians is enough to massively reduce Germany's armed forces, to create areas of weakness. The Allies find ways of invading continental Europe, and then Germany is facing war across Europe on multiple fronts and is eventually pushed back and defeated. In this case, very close to when it occurred in our timeline in the summer of 1945. The Japan surrender, I mean, the reason really for that delay is the lack of nuclear weapons. The computer and often doesn't deploy nuclear weapons in the same way. Often it is a more protracted war because of, not least because of Spain, of Japan's naval power. So the sort of island hopping strategy that the USA deploys is slightly trickier, as much for gameplay reasons. The whole naval invasion thing in Hoi 4 is, yes, you can have nightmares of the naval invasion alarm triggering at all times. But Yeah, it is a more protracted campaign in the Pacific, and I suppose that is something to reflect on. Obviously, the debate around the deployment of nuclear weapons is particularly strong at the moment, given current frictions in Europe as of summer 2024, but also Oppenheimer, that's been a recent film release that's made us reflect again on the development and use of nuclear weapons. But without them, an extra 3 years of conflict in the Pacific. Not that Hoi4 is here to, be part of our sort of historical reflections, but it's an interesting prospect that without the deployment of those weapons, and an additional 3 years of conflict might have been necessary in the Pacific to see Japan ultimately defeated. And how Japan is ultimately defeated is with an invasion of the home islands, which, of course, for many is the clearest rationale behind the use of nuclear weapons, is that it actually meant that Allied troops did not have to invade the home islands and face a very prolonged and bloody war to force Japanese surrender on Japanese soil. And as the argument goes, actually might have led to less people dying in that campaign than were ultimately killed through the use of nuclear weapons. Not an argument I love, but there's plenty of argument out there also that Japan was ready to surrender, that non-nuclear bombings were starting to have their effect as well. And of course, don't really want to reflect too much on the many people that were vaporized because of the use of nuclear weapons. Anyway, yes, an interesting question there, and one perhaps raised through Hoi4 and the fact that those 3 additional years of war seem necessary without nuclear weapons to force Japanese surrender. So how does our sort of historical timeline of World War II play out? So in terms of the early war, again, Italy is victorious in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Fascist forces win the civil war in Spain, so that goes along historical lines because we're following the historical paths. Hitler rises to power in Germany, remains expansion in Central Europe, beginning with the reoccupation of Rhineland in March 36. So again, along historical lines, the USA passes the Neutrality Act, May 37. Japan invasion of China leads to a long and bloody conflict. So again, we're talking about a conflict that spans over a decade in this timeline to 1948. Nazi Germany invades Poland in August 1939, followed quickly by the Benelux region, Denmark and Norway in October 39, Lightning Campaign. So again, the mechanics of the game kind of don't allow for the phony war, and it's a very interesting period. It's amazing to think that at the outset of World War II, there was still a sort of appeasement occurring. There was a reluctance from the Allies to really push in against Nazi Germany, and it's again an interesting alt history debate. If the Allies had been more aggressive during that period of the phony war, could the Nazi regime have been stopped in its tracks? In this instance, Hoi4 would suggest no, that regardless of how many fronts the Nazi forces the Wehrmacht might have been engaged on, it was adequate to hold and push back the Allies. However, the defensive stance in the phony war evidently did little to prepare the Allies for the eventual Nazi assault on France when it did come. So an interesting conundrum there. Western offensive continues into France. Paris falls in December 39. Eastern offensive begins in July 1941. The Nazi Germany breaks the fragile alliance with the Soviet Union, invades Russia. Japanese aggression in the Pacific, an invasion of the Philippines, as we noted, rather than Pearl Harbor in July 41, leads to the USA entering the war. Heavy losses in the Russian fleet leads to Nazi Germany losing ground and suing for peace in July 41. The Japanese Empire continues to fight on in the Pacific until May 1948. So that's our historical timeline for World War II, and some fascinating differences there, particularly the persistence of conflict in the Pacific, and particularly the influence of that lack of a phony war that ultimately doesn't help the Allies in any particular way. Kind of points to the power of the Nazi war machine that's portrayed as much in Hoi 4 as was experienced in real world. So what about these scores then? I mean, let's have a look at how World War II kind of played out. So the average scores. So these are basically the most powerful militaries at the end of the Second World War. On the far left, we've got the average across all campaigns. So the UK emerges at the top, as does, because we're talking in both circumstances of Germany facing defeat. I mean, I only played the 7 campaigns, so the 7 main nations. So the Allies are victorious and the Axis powers are defeated. So it's understandable that Germany is down the list, that Japan is down the list, that France is down the list, that Italy is down the list. And the most powerful militaries are those of the successful Allies. So we've got the UK, the USA, and the Soviet Union out on top. Somewhat the same in my campaigns there. So the USA and the United Kingdom. With Italy, I did go down the track of kind of betraying the Germans. So I do enter the war. Japan, yeah, kind of entered into sort of perma warfare with some of these nations. So I didn't necessarily be defeated, but I did sort of got to a point where I just kind of called it almost because the conflict was going on more or less indefinitely. But I certainly didn't perform well with the Soviet Union. I mean, the armed forces after this came out incredibly battered. So they're down the list. IRL, I've kind of looked again to sort of represent the scoring in a similar fashion, which is a lot more straightforward to do in Hoi 4, really, because it's just about volume of military forces, if you will. So the USA naturally and the Soviet Union come out on top, with the UK in third, largely because of the Navy, which remains, significant at this time. France, Italy, Japan, and Germany, again, with the defeated Axis, the military resources of Germany, Japan, and of Italy dramatically reduced in this circumstance. So then sort of looking at some stats then, if you like. So at the top, the Axis to the Allies kill ratio. So I sort of worked this out based on total kills, almost 3-1. So the Axis power is far more effective, if you will, in the field than the Allies. And again, somewhat because of the destruction to the Allied forces that was wrought on the Eastern Front for the Soviet Union, and more particularly in China, with immense losses in the Sino-Japanese War. So real-world statistics puts the total death toll at 70 to 85 million total deaths, with military deaths being between 21 and 25 million. I mean, as we said, in terms of brutality, just astronomical numbers. And military deaths at 20 odd million, but the civilian and other deaths, pushing it up toward, up over maybe 80 million people directly from the conflict. So absolutely immense destruction globally, with the Allies suffering around 16 million military deaths and the Axis powers around 8. So IRL, the Axis power is also more effective in the field at a rate of about 2-1, as opposed to 3-1. So in our timeline, the Axis power is more effective. Something to talk about there. The in-game war, though, was far deadlier, and I suppose that's a bit to do with the longer conflict in the East. But racking up 48 million military deaths, I mean, that's pretty extreme, right? Pretty much double the number of military deaths, which would suggest that the number of civilian deaths could possibly be, twice as many as well. We could be talking of 150 to 200 million deaths in a Hoi 4, in this kind of Hoi 4 scenario, World War II, with the Axis powers suffering around, the Allied powers suffering around 33 million military deaths, and the Axis powers suffering around 50 million. So again, about 2-1 in terms of total military deaths. High proportion of Allied losses were victims of the Second Sino-Japanese War, with China suffering more than 18 million military deaths. Hell's bells, right? So in our World War, the Japanese and Chinese conflict, again, very, very, very deadly, but China's suffering 18 million military deaths, almost as much as was suffered in the whole of our sort of IRL conflict. And the Japanese military was the most quote unquote effective, with a kill ratio of 6.3 to 1, followed by the USA with 2.3. Sort of an observation there of the better quote unquote performing militaries. But some of these numbers, even though it's a game, it's quite sickening, isn't it? Really, it does make you wonder about how you ever represent such a conflict in art or media or gaming. To see it laid out like that is quite galling. But anyway, there we go. Some observations on this alt history gamified World War II for you. So what observations can we bring out of this then? Well, continues with policy of appeasement of Nazi Germany. So both in our historical and our sort of alt history, we saw appeasement play out, the Allies throughout the 1930s, and even upon the assumption, even upon the start of World War II with Germany's invasion of Poland, don't show the aggression to face the German army in the field early in the conflict. So we get that growth of conflict across Europe and ultimate Allied defeat in France. The invasion of Russia is Nazi Germany's undoing. Again, a big alt history moment, Nazi Germany's ambition, Nazi Germany's ideology of expansion, and the campaign of extermination that it wrought in Russia, in both of our game timelines as well as in the real world, is pretty much the undoing of the regime. A long grinding conflict in all instances that ultimately lead to the resources and manpower of Germany being heavily reduced, and the turning point of the conflict with Soviet Russia, again, being where the majority of the war is conducted. And, as in real world, as in our alternative timelines, the Sino-Japanese conflict is the deadliest theatre, at least in our game world. And it's every bit as deadly in the real world. So all-out brutality in Eastern Europe and East Asia is, are the primary drivers both of the massive death and destruction of the World War, and ultimately of the demise of the Axis powers. So yeah, art representing history here, but it's quite hard to come away from some of this and with the joy of a game well played, because of the immense destruction that you can experience within the game. But it's interesting to see how the game goes as far as it can, really, in bringing home some of the brutality, the realities of what is and remains, thankfully, the world's greatest and deadliest conflict. Quite a sad point to end this little series to reflect on, but we've got a few just wrap-up videos to do. But otherwise, thanks for joining me in this series of Gaming Through History. There might be some more to come as I sort of explore my old catalogue of games, but we wrap up the Paradox timeline. It's now 1948. Japan has just surrendered to the Allies, and we are hopeful for a prolonged era of peace and harmony. Thank you very much, and bye for now.